Only $10 a painting!
Annie called out, lifting a small canvas above her shoulder as the cold wind moved through King Street. A few people turned their heads. Most kept walking. Annie Carter stood beside the brick wall between a leather boutique and a cafe, her old blue blanket spread neatly at her feet. 15 small canvases rested on it in 2 careful rows. She had painted them in the corner of her bedroom, late at night after the house went quiet, using the last good brushes Sister Grace had given her years ago. Beside the paintings sat a cardboard sign written in blue marker. Paintings for Street. Mary's Children Home, $10 each. She smiled at an older couple passing by. Good afternoon, ma'am. Sir. These are hand-painted. The money goes to Street Mary's Children Home. The woman slowed. You painted all of these? Yes, ma'am. Annie picked up one canvas. This one is called The Empty Chair. It's about a child waiting for a family to come sit at the table with them. I used warm light here because I didn't want it to feel hopeless. Just waiting. The woman took it and turned it over. Her husband leaned in, frowned, then looked at the sign. $10? He asked. Yes, sir. For something this small? Annie kept her voice even. Small enough to carry home. Big enough to help buy breakfast for the kids. The woman's face softened, but only for a moment. She handed the painting back. It's sweet. We're just looking today. Thank you for stopping, Annie said. She placed the canvas back with care. A man in a navy coat picked up a painting of 2 children sharing a blue blanket. He flipped it over, rubbed the corner with his thumb, then said, I'll give you 5. The price is 10, sir. It's not framed. It's still my work. He gave a small laugh. Charity usually means people give what they can. And I'm giving my work, Annie said. $10 is the price. He stared at her, surprised by the firmness, then dropped the painting back onto the blanket. Good luck with that. A teenage girl stopped next, tugging at her mother's sleeve. Mom, look at this one. Annie reached for the canvas before the girl touched the damp edge. Careful, honey. That one's new. It's called Window Light. It's about a child watching a family leave after visiting the orphanage. But I painted the window gold because even when someone isn't chosen that day, the light doesn't leave. The girl looked at it for a long second. That's really good. Her mother picked up the painting, turned it over twice, then set it down. We don't need anything sad in the house. Annie nodded. I understand. More people began to pause. Not enough to buy, just enough to look. They lifted the canvases, tilted them toward the gray afternoon light, whispered about the price, asked whether she had a permit, whether the children's home knew, whether she was really donating the money. Annie answered each question politely. Then a sharp voice cut through the small crowd. Annie Carter. Annie went still. A woman in a cream-colored coat pushed her way forward. Her hair was pinned in a perfect twist. Her lipstick bright. Her eyes cold enough to make the wind feel warmer by comparison. Denise Carter, her stepmother, stopped in front of the blanket and looked down at the paintings as if they were dirty laundry Annie had dragged into public. So this is where you ran off to, Denise said. Annie swallowed. I told you I was going to raise money for Street Mary's. You told me you had errands. There are dishes in the sink, laundry in the hallway, and dinner not started. Denise looked at the tin box beside the sign. How much did you make? Annie stepped closer to it. That money is for the children's home. I asked how much. A woman nearby raised her eyebrows. Is that your mother? My stepmother, Annie said. Denise bent and reached for the box. Annie caught it first. Please don't, Annie said quietly. Denise's smile did not reach her eyes. Don't embarrass me in public. A man in sunglasses picked up one of the canvases. Wait a minute. If her stepmother didn't know she was here, how do we know these are even hers? They are mine, Annie said. The man turned the painting over. Maybe she stole them and came out here with some orphan story. Another woman took a step back. That happens. People use fake charity stories all the time. I'm not using anything, Annie said. I grew up at Street Mary's. Mr. Harold Benson, the leather shop owner, stepped out of his boutique. What seems to be the trouble? This girl may be selling stolen artwork, the man in sunglasses said. They're not stolen, Annie said. Then prove it, someone muttered. Annie looked at the faces around her. Some were doubtful, some were eager, some had already decided. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a sketch pad and a charcoal pencil. "If you think I stole them, I can draw right now," she said. "Pick anything." The crowd quieted. The teenage girl pointed toward the cafe window. "Draw the waitress." Inside, Mrs. Helen Parker was pouring coffee into a white mug, her gray hair tucked under a small black visor. Annie sat on the edge of the low brick planter, placed the sketch pad on her knee, and began. Her hand moved quickly. She drew the slope of Mrs. Helen's shoulders, the coffee pot in her hand, the soft tiredness around her eyes, the kindness in her mouth. For a few minutes, no one spoke. Even Denise stayed silent. Annie turned the pad around. The girl whispered, "Mom, that's her." Mrs. Helen came to the cafe door, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the sketch, then at Annie. "Well, Lord have mercy," she said. "That's better than my driver's license photo." The man in sunglasses looked away. Could have been luck. Annie stood. "I can draw you next." He did not answer. Denise snapped, "Enough. Pack up. You're coming home." "No," Annie said. The word came out before she could soften it. Denise's face hardened. "Excuse me? That money is not yours. These paintings are not yours. And Street Mary's is not some excuse I made up." Denise stepped closer. "You live under my roof. I was adopted by Robert and Elaine Carter," Annie said, her voice shaking but clear. "Elaine taught me to give. Robert taught me to stand straight. You don't get to take that from me." The crowd shifted again. Before Denise could answer, the people at the edge of the sidewalk parted. A tall white man in a gray wool coat stepped through the opening slowly, not with the rushed curiosity of someone chasing gossip, but with the calm attention of a man used to people moving when he approached. Mr. Harold Benson straightened immediately. "Mr. Harrington." Whispers moved through the crowd. "That's William Harrington. The Harrington from the Waterfront Project? The billionaire?" William Harrington glanced at the gathered faces before his eyes settled on Annie. Not on the paintings first. On Annie. On the charcoal dust still smudged across her fingers. On the way, she stood between the blanket and the tin box as if protecting both. "What's happening here?" he asked. The man in sunglasses finally shrugged. "People are trying to figure out whether those paintings are actually hers." William looked at Annie. "Are they?" "Yes, sir," Annie said quietly. Denise folded her arms. "Mr. Harrington, this is just family business." Annie has a habit of running toward attention instead of responsibility. William's gaze shifted to Denise for only a moment before returning to the paintings. He crouched beside the blanket, careful not to step on the edge. One painting held his attention longer than the rest. A crowded bedroom, 6 bunk beds, a small child sitting awake on the floor holding a stuffed bear, moonlight stretching across worn wooden boards. In the corner, a tiny paint box resting beneath the window. "What's this one called?" he asked. Annie swallowed. "The Room That Stayed Awake." William looked up slightly. "Why?" "Because some rooms in orphanages never really sleep," Annie answered. "Children whisper. Some cry quietly because they don't want the others to hear. Some wait for footsteps in the hallway hoping somebody came back for them." "And the paint box?" William asked. Annie looked at the canvas. "That part matters to me." "Why?" "Because when I lived at Street Mary's, drawing was the only thing that made the room feel less lonely." Something shifted in William's expression then. Behind him, Denise gave a short laugh. She always knows how to make a story sound dramatic. William finally stood and turned toward Denise. "Did she paint these?" Denise hesitated half a second too long. "She likes to doodle." The crowd exchanged looks. William reached toward the sketchpad Annie had used moments earlier. Mrs. Helen's portrait stared back from the page with startling detail. "You drew this just now?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "How long did it take?" "Maybe 4 or 5 minutes." Mrs. Helen pushed open the cafe door again. "Closer to 4, she said. And she got my tired eyes exactly right. A few people laughed softly. William looked back at Annie. "Did you study art somewhere?" "No, sir." "Then who taught you?" "Sister Grace gave me paper when nobody else thought it mattered." William glanced toward the cardboard sign. "Street Mary's Children Home." "Yes, sir." "You grew up there?" Annie nodded. A cold gust of wind swept through the street, rattling the cafe windows. Annie rubbed her hands together without realizing it. William noticed. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. "I'm all right." Her stomach answered for her with a small, hollow sound. Denise sighed loudly. She skipped lunch because she rushed out of the house this morning acting like some street performer. Annie lowered her eyes for a second. The humiliation burned worse because Denise knew exactly where to press. William slipped one hand into his coat pocket and took out his wallet. "How much for this one?" he asked, lifting the room that stayed awake carefully by the edges. "It's $10. That's all?" "Yes, sir." "Why only 10? Annie hesitated. "Because," she said slowly, "people are more willing to spend $10 than stop and care for 10 minutes. If Annie's story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about courage, kindness, and justice." William removed a $100 bill and held it out to her. Annie blinked. "Sir, I don't have change for that. I'm not asking for change. It's only 10. Then write 10 for the painting and 90 as a donation." Denise immediately stepped forward. "I'll hold on to that for her." William did not even look at her hand. "No, ma'am." Annie carefully took the bill, then opened her small notebook with fingers still trembling from the earlier accusations. She wrote neatly, "William Harrington, $100. Painting, $10. Donation, $90. Purpose, food, blankets, art supplies." William watched her write every word. "You keep records? I don't want anyone wondering where the money goes." William closed his wallet slowly. "That notebook has more honesty in it than some corporate reports I've read." Mr. Benson coughed into his hand, avoiding Annie's eyes. Denise forced another smile. "Mr. Harrington." Annie gets carried away with these little emotional projects. William looked directly at her now. Helping children stay warm through winter is not a little project. Denise's expression tightened. William turned back to Annie. "Would you allow me to buy you a hot chocolate?" Denise answered before Annie could. "She's coming home." Annie lifted her head. "No." The word surprised even her. Denise's eyes sharpened. "Excuse me?" "I said no." Annie's voice shook, but she did not back away. "I came here for Street Mary's. I'm staying." A few people exchanged glances. The same crowd that had doubted her now watched like they were seeing her for the first time. William spoke gently. "We can sit near the window. Your paintings will stay where you can see them." Annie hesitated, but William was still holding her painting carefully, not casually, like it mattered. Finally, Annie nodded once. "All right." Mrs. Helen opened the cafe door wider. "Come on in, honey, before your hands turn into ice." As Annie bent to straighten the paintings on the blanket, she noticed something strange. Nobody touched them now. William waited beside the cafe door while Annie secured the tin box inside her canvas bag. Denise stood a few feet away, furious and embarrassed in equal measure. "You're making a mistake," Denise muttered. Annie looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe," she said softly, "but at least this mistake belongs to me." Then she followed William Harrington inside the cafe while the cold Charleston wind swept through King Street and moved the edge of the blue blanket like a flag refusing to fold. Warm air wrapped around Annie the moment she stepped inside the cafe. After hours in the cold wind, even the smell of coffee and baked bread felt almost unreal. Mrs. Helen pointed them toward a small table near the front window. "You sit there where you can still watch your paintings," she said. "And don't argue with me about the hot chocolate. It's already coming." "Thank you," Annie murmured. William waited until she sat before taking the chair across from her. He rested the room that stayed awake carefully against the wall beside the table instead of laying it flat like an object somebody had bought on impulse. Outside, the crowd still lingered near the blue blanket. Some people pretended to study store windows while glancing back toward the cafe. Denise remained on the sidewalk with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Mrs. Helen returned with a large mug topped with whipped cream and placed it gently in front of Annie. "You need real food too, honey. I'm bringing soup." "Oh, I can't pay for. You let me worry about that." Annie lowered her eyes. "Thank you." Mrs. Helen glanced toward William. "You're the reason half the street suddenly discovered they have consciences, aren't you?" William gave a faint smile. "I don't think they'd appreciate hearing it put that way." "Well," Mrs. Helen said, "truth doesn't stop being truth because it hurts feelings." She walked off before either of them could answer. For a moment, Annie held the mug with both hands, letting the warmth settle into her fingers. William watched quietly, not the way some wealthy men watched people they intended to rescue, but the way someone listens before deciding what matters. "You really grew up at Street Mary's?" he asked. Annie nodded. From 6 until I was 13. And then the Carters adopted you? Robert and Elaine did. Her voice softened slightly at Elaine's name. Elaine passed away 2 years ago. William's expression changed. I'm sorry. She was kind. Annie stared down into the hot chocolate. The kind of person who remembered little things, like how I hated peas and loved cinnamon toast. She smiled faintly. She used to say if a child trusted you enough to tell you what scared them, you treated that like something holy. William leaned back slightly in his chair. She sounds wiser than most executives I know. Annie laughed quietly before she could stop herself. It surprised her enough that she looked embarrassed afterward. That's the first time you've laughed since I walked over there, William said. The smile faded from Annie's face almost immediately, as her eyes drifted toward the window again. Denise was speaking angrily to Mr. Benson outside. She'll be furious when I get home, Annie admitted. Your stepmother? Yes. You're 18. That doesn't stop people from trying to own your choices. William nodded once like he understood more than he intended to explain. Mrs. Helen returned with tomato soup and half a grilled cheese sandwich. Annie opened her mouth to protest again, but Mrs. Helen pointed a spoon at her. Eat first. Cried later. Yes, ma'am. The soup disappeared faster than Annie meant it to. She realized halfway through that William had noticed how hungry she was pretending not to be. You haven't been taking care of yourself, he said quietly. Annie looked uncomfortable. The children at Street Mary's need things more. That answer worries me more than it impresses me. She blinked at him. William folded his hands loosely on the table. People who spend their lives taking care of everyone else usually believe they're the least important person in the room. Annie lowered her spoon slowly. No one had ever said that to her before. Outside, a few people finally drifted away from the sidewalk, but several still stood near the paintings. One older man bent to read the cardboard sign again. William glanced toward the blanket. How long have you been painting? Since I was little. Since Street Mary's? Yes. Annie smiled faintly at the memory. Sister Grace found me drawing on the back of church donation envelopes because we ran out of paper, and she encouraged it. She gave me an old paint box someone donated. Half the colors were dried out. Annie shook her head softly. I thought it was the greatest thing I'd ever owned. William looked at the painting beside the wall again. The box in the corner. Annie nodded. That's it. The cafe grew quieter around them. The late afternoon crowd had started thinning, leaving only the low sound of dishes clinking and muted conversation from the counter. William studied Annie for several seconds before speaking again. Tell me honestly, how bad is Street Mary's right now? Annie hesitated. Worse than Sister Grace admits, she finally said. There are too many children and not enough beds. The roof leaks upstairs when it rains hard. Some of the younger kids share winter coats because donations dropped this year. She paused. Last week, Lily asked me if crayons count as school supplies or toys because she didn't want to waste them. Who's Lily? She's 6. Annie smiled sadly. She sleeps with one sock on because she lost the other and doesn't want the staff spending money replacing it. William looked away briefly toward the window. She asked me something yesterday. Annie continued softly. What? She asked if children get sent away when orphanages run out of money. The question settled heavily between them. William exhaled slowly through his nose. And what did you tell her? That I wouldn't let that happen. But you're not sure you can keep that promise. Annie looked down at the soup. No. For the first time since entering the cafe, William's face showed something unguarded. Not business calculation, not social politeness. Regret. My mother volunteered at a children's home when I was growing up, he said quietly. Different place, same kind of hallways, same smell of cafeteria food. He gave a faint smile at the memory. She used to drag me there every Christmas whether I wanted to go or not. Annie listened carefully. She told me something once. William continued. The measure of a society is how quickly children learn they're alone. He looked at Annie. I haven't thought about that in years. Outside, Denise finally turned and walked away down the street without looking back. Annie watched her disappear around the corner. Relief mixed strangely with guilt inside her chest. William noticed her expression. You don't have to apologize for standing up for yourself. I know. Annie wrapped both hands around the mug again. I'm just not used to doing it. Mrs. Helen stopped beside the table with the coffee pot. You know, she said casually. That crowd out there looked real ready to judge until they saw that girl draw. William glanced toward Annie. People are comfortable doubting talent when it comes from the wrong person. Mrs. Helen snorted softly. Charleston's been doing that since before either of us were born. Annie stared at the steam rising from her mug. After a moment, William reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card, sliding it gently across the table. "I'd like to visit Street Mary's tomorrow," he said. Annie looked down at the card but did not touch it yet. "You don't have to decide now," William added. "And I'm not asking for publicity. No cameras, no reporters. You really want to see it?" "Yes." "Why?" William's eyes moved briefly toward the painting against the wall. "Because that room you painted..." He paused. "Nobody paints loneliness that accurately, unless they survived it." Annie finally picked up the card. Outside the cafe window, the blue blanket still rested on the sidewalk beneath the fading Charleston light, surrounded by paintings most people had almost walked past without seeing. Annie left the cafe after sunset with the blue blanket folded under one arm and the tin box tucked tightly inside her canvas bag. The Charleston air had turned colder, carrying the damp smell of rain from the harbor. William walked beside her toward the parking lot across the street, still carrying the room that stayed awake carefully against his coat. "You don't have to walk me," Annie said. "I know. That usually means people think I can't handle myself." William glanced at her. "You handled an entire crowd alone this afternoon. I think you're doing all right." Annie looked down for a second, hiding the small smile that threatened to appear. At the edge of the parking lot, a black SUV waited beneath a street lamp. The driver stepped out immediately when he saw William approaching. "Mr. Harrington." "It's all right, Daniel," William said. "I'll only be another minute." Daniel nodded politely before returning to the driver's seat. Annie stopped walking. "You really carry paintings around yourself?" William looked at the canvas in his hands. "Most things people buy me end up forgotten in offices." He glanced at the painting. "This one won't." The answer embarrassed her more than praise would have. William opened the back door of his SUV and placed the painting inside carefully. When he turned back, Annie was staring toward the sidewalk across the street. Mr. Benson stood outside his boutique, locking the front door. For a brief second, his eyes met Annie's. Then he gave her a small nod before disappearing inside. "That looked painful for him," William said. Annie laughed softly through her nose. "You noticed? I've spent 30 years around wealthy Southern businessmen. Pride practically pays their electric bills." The laughter faded quickly when Annie noticed Denise standing near the bus stop farther down the street, arms folded, waiting. William followed her gaze. "Do you need me to stay?" "No." Annie straightened slightly. "If I keep needing someone beside me every time she's angry, then she'll never stop being angry." William studied her for a moment. "That sounds exhausting." "It is." Denise spotted Annie and started toward them immediately, heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "So now you're getting chauffeured around by billionaires?" she snapped before she fully reached them. "Good evening," William said calmly. Denise's expression shifted at once, smoothing into politeness. "Mr. Harrington, I apologize for earlier." Annie can be emotional. Annie closed her eyes briefly. William's tone remained even. "I didn't find her emotional. I found her honest." Denise ignored that. "She gets carried away with these little rescue fantasies." "They aren't fantasies," Annie said quietly. Denise turned on her immediately. "And what exactly are you rescuing anyone with? Paintings on a blanket?" William watched Annie carefully then, as if waiting to see whether she would retreat again. "She's trying," he said before Annie could answer. "That already puts her ahead of most people." Denise's jaw tightened. "You barely know her," she said. William looked at Annie standing there in her worn jacket with charcoal still faintly staining her fingertips. "No," he answered. "But I know what kind of person keeps defending children after being humiliated in public." The silence afterward felt heavier than shouting. Denise finally looked away first. "Robert's waiting at home," she muttered to Annie. "And he's worried." At the mention of her father, Annie's shoulders softened slightly. "Is he angry?" "No," Denise admitted sharply. "Just worried." That hurt Annie in a different way. William noticed the change immediately. "Your father sounds kinder than the rest of the house." "He is," Annie said softly. "He just..." She hesitated. "He avoids conflict too much." William nodded slowly, like that explained more than she realized. Rain began tapping lightly against the pavement. Daniel stepped out of the SUV again with an umbrella. William waved him back toward the car. "I'll manage." Denise glanced toward the rain with irritation. "Can we go?" Annie looked at William. "About tomorrow." "Yes? You can come to Street Mary's." She paused. "But don't promise them anything unless you mean it." William met her eyes directly. "I won't." For a moment neither moved. Then Annie reached into her bag and carefully tore a page from her notebook. She wrote down the address to Street Mary's Children Home, along with Sister Grace's name beneath it. Her handwriting stayed neat, even in the rain. William folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket instead of his wallet, like something he intended to keep close. "What time should I come?" he asked. "Morning is better. The younger kids have breakfast around 8. "Then I'll be there." Denise exhaled impatiently. "Wonderful. Can we leave now?" Annie ignored the comment and looked back at William one last time. "Thank you for today. You don't owe me thanks." Most people would have kept walking. William glanced toward the crowded street behind them. "That says more about the street than it does about me." The rain picked up harder. Annie pulled her jacket tighter and started toward the bus stop beside Denise. Halfway there, she turned back suddenly. "Mr. Harrington?" "Yes." "The painting." She hesitated. "The child in the corner holding the bear. That was you." It was not a question. Annie stood still beneath the rain for a second before nodding once. William looked through the SUV window toward the canvas resting inside. "You painted yourself very small," he said quietly. Annie gave a faint smile that carried no real happiness inside it. "That's how children learn to survive in places where nobody's coming." She turned before he could answer and walked toward the bus stop. William remained beside the SUV long after Annie and Denise climbed onto the city bus. Through the rain-streaked windows, he watched Annie sit near the back while Denise spoke sharply beside her the entire time. Annie never answered once. When the bus finally disappeared into traffic, Daniel approached carefully. "Sir?" William did not look away from the street right away. "Did you hear the way that girl talked about those children?" "Yes, sir. She spoke like someone carrying an entire building on her shoulders." Daniel hesitated. "Some people start carrying things young." William looked down at the rainwater gathering along the curb. Then his eyes drifted toward the painting inside the SUV again. A small child beneath moonlight. A room full of children pretending sleep came easily. A paint box hidden in the corner like proof hope had survived another night. "Change tomorrow's schedule," William said suddenly. Daniel blinked. "Sir, cancel the Charleston Harbor meeting. That meeting took 3 months to arrange." "I know." William opened the SUV door slowly. "Street Mary's matters more." Daniel stared at him for a second before nodding quietly. "Yes, sir." William slid into the back seat beside the painting. The city lights moved across the window as rain spread through Charleston, washing over expensive storefronts, polished sidewalks, and dark apartment windows alike. But William Harrington could not stop thinking about one sentence Annie had spoken in the cafe. "People are more willing to spend $10 than stop and care for 10 minutes. For the first time in years, the words followed him home louder than business reports, louder than investors, louder than his own carefully managed life. And somewhere across the city, inside a crowded children's home with a leaking roof, a little girl named Lily was probably sleeping with one sock on, because she did not want anyone wasting money replacing the other. Annie barely slept that night. Rain tapped against the small bedroom window while Denise moved around downstairs louder than necessary, slamming cabinets and muttering under her breath about public embarrassment and people chasing attention. Annie lay awake staring at the ceiling. Elaine's old quilt pulled over her shoulders, trying not to replay the afternoon in her head. The accusation, the crowd, William Harrington standing in the middle of it all holding her painting like it mattered. Around midnight, she heard Robert come home from the garage. His boots crossed the kitchen floor slowly. Denise immediately started talking the second he walked through the door. She stood downtown making a spectacle of herself. Annie closed her eyes. "You know people were talking?" Denise continued downstairs. "Somebody nearly called the police." Robert's voice stayed calm. "Did she do anything wrong?" "She was selling paintings in the middle of King Street like some sidewalk hustler." A long pause followed. Then Robert asked quietly, "Did she raise money for the children?" Denise did not answer immediately. "That's not the point." "No," Robert said. "That sounds exactly like the point. Annie pressed the blanket tighter against herself. More silence drifted through the house before Robert finally spoke again, softer this time. "She's got Elaine's heart." The words hit Annie harder than Denise's insults ever could. She heard Denise sigh sharply. "Elaine spoiled her." "No," Robert answered. "Elaine loved her." The house went quiet after that. Annie did not realize she had started crying until she felt tears sliding into her hairline. The next morning, Charleston woke gray and cold. Annie left early before Denise could start another argument. She carried the canvas bag over one shoulder and held a tray of grocery store muffins balanced carefully in both hands. Street Mary's children's home sat at the end of a narrow street, where the sidewalks cracked and weeds pushed through the edges. The building itself looked tired. White paint peeled from the wooden railings. One shutter hung slightly crooked upstairs. Near the side entrance, a plastic bucket sat beneath a brown water stain from the leaking roof. But the moment Annie stepped through the front door, warmth rushed toward her in the form of noise. Children arguing over cereal, laughter from the hallway, a baby crying somewhere upstairs, and the smell of oatmeal thick enough to live in the walls. Annie, a little girl, came racing across the dining room wearing mismatched socks and an oversized sweater slipping off one shoulder. Lily. Annie barely had time to set down the muffins before Lily threw herself into her arms. "You came back. I said I would." Annie smiled, lifting her slightly. "And look at your socks." Lily looked down proudly. "I found another yellow one. They don't match. They're cousins." Annie laughed before she could stop herself. Sister Grace appeared from the kitchen doorway carrying a clipboard and reading glasses low on her nose. She was nearly 70, small-framed, with silver hair pinned neatly back, and the tired eyes of someone who had spent decades carrying children through heartbreak. "Well," she said dryly, "either the building is under attack or Annie Carter just walked in." Several children cheered. Annie hugged her carefully. "Morning, Sister Grace. You look tired. I could say the same to you." "That's because we're both right." Sister Grace noticed the canvas bag immediately. "You sold paintings yesterday?" "A few." "How many?" "Just one," Lily gasped. "One whole painting?" Annie nodded. "One whole painting. To a real person?" Lily asked seriously. "A very real person." The little girl looked impressed by that. Sister Grace motioned Annie toward the kitchen while the children attacked the muffins behind them. "You ate?" Sister Grace asked quietly once they were alone near the pantry shelves. Annie hesitated. "That bad, huh? I had soup. Yesterday?" "Yes." Sister Grace closed her eyes briefly. "Lord help me, child. I'm fine." That answer usually means the opposite. Before Annie could defend herself, the front bell rang. Both women glanced toward the hallway. "You expecting someone?" Annie asked. "No." A moment later, one of the older boys peeked around the corner. "Sister Grace? There's a man outside." "What kind of man?" The boy shrugged. "Fancy." Annie already knew. William Harrington stepped inside carrying 2 large cardboard trays from a bakery and wearing the same gray wool coat from the day before. Behind him came Daniel carrying several grocery bags. Every child in the dining room went silent, not because they recognized him, because rich people almost never walk through that front door without cameras. William paused as dozens of small eyes stared at him. Lily whispered loudly to Annie, "That's definitely a rich person." Annie almost choked, trying not to laugh. William held up the bakery trays awkwardly. "I wasn't sure what children actually liked, so the woman at the bakery made the decision for me." One of the boys narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "What is it?" Daniel answered first. "Chocolate chip muffins." The entire room changed instantly. Children surged forward until Sister Grace clapped her hands sharply. "Nobody tackles the billionaire before breakfast." William blinked once, caught completely off guard. Even Daniel laughed quietly. Annie stepped toward him. "You came." "I said I would." His eyes moved through the building slowly. The worn floors, the patched walls, the dining tables with mismatched chairs, the crowded coat hooks overflowing with tiny jackets. Nothing in the room was dramatic enough for headlines. That somehow made it worse. Lily stared openly at him. "Are you famous?" William looked down at her. "Sometimes against my will." "Do famous people always wear coats that expensive?" Daniel coughed suddenly into his fist. Annie covered her mouth. William looked completely serious. Apparently children ask harder questions than reporters. Lily considered that carefully. Probably because reporters get paid. Sister Grace finally stepped forward, extending her hand. William Harrington, I assume. Yes, ma'am. You really came without reporters. I told Annie I would. Sister Grace studied him quietly before nodding once. Most people promise children things because children forgive disappointment easier than adults. Her eyes sharpened slightly. I hope you're not one of those people. William met her gaze directly. No, ma'am. I'm beginning to think I've already disappointed enough people for one lifetime. The room fell quieter after that. Annie watched him carefully. Most wealthy men tried to sound important. William sounded tired. Lily tugged Annie's sleeve suddenly. Can he see the art room? Annie smiled faintly. It's barely a room. That's okay, Lily whispered. Maybe rich people can still imagine. William heard that, and for the first time since walking into Street Mary's, something in his expression finally cracked. Not visibly enough for the children to notice. But Annie did. The art room sat at the end of the upstairs hallway behind a door that stuck during humid weather. Lily pushed it open with both hands while William followed Annie inside. The room was smaller than the word room deserved. Half the ceiling showed water stains from the leaking roof. 3 folding tables filled most of the space, each covered in paint marks and tiny carved initials from children who needed proof they had existed somewhere. Shelves along the wall held cracked jars of brushes, dried markers, and construction paper sorted carefully by size because nothing could be wasted. But the walls stopped William cold. Drawings covered nearly every inch. Children flying above rooftops. Mothers returning through bright front doors. Dogs bigger than cars. Birthday cakes. Families holding hands. And over one small corner table hung Annie's paintings. Not the polished ones from the sidewalk. Older ones. Rougher. Honest in a way expensive galleries rarely survived. William stepped closer to one canvas showing a boy standing alone at a school window while snow fell outside. That one's hers too, Lily announced proudly behind him. Annie leaned against the doorway, embarrassed suddenly. Lily, what? Lily shrugged. You made it. William studied the painting carefully. How old were you? 14. And nobody trained you? Annie shook her head. Daniel slowly turned in place, taking in the room. Sir, William did not answer immediately. A little boy near the back tugged on his sleeve. Mister, are you rich? Or pretend rich? Sister Grace closed her eyes briefly. Malcolm, what? It matters. William looked down at him seriously. I'm not sure yet. The children laughed. Malcolm pointed toward Annie's paintings. She says rich people only buy art if another rich person tells them it's important. Annie stared at him. I said some rich people. You said most. William glanced back at Annie with the faintest hint of amusement. Good to know my reputation arrived before I did. It wasn't personal, Annie muttered. I'm beginning to think it should have been. Lily climbed onto one of the folding chairs and held up a drawing proudly toward William. This is our building when it rains. William took the paper gently. The drawing showed children sleeping beneath umbrellas indoors, while water dripped from the ceiling into buckets. One child held a flashlight under the blanket like a tiny campfire. William's expression changed. Does it really leak that badly? He asked quietly. Sister Grace answered this time. Only upstairs. Then after a pause, and the hallway, and occasionally, the dining room. Daniel looked toward the ceiling automatically. We patch what we can, Sister Grace continued. But donations have dropped this year. Most people prefer causes that photograph better. Nobody laughed at that. William walked slowly farther into the room. Every few steps, another drawing stopped him. He noticed how often the children painted windows. Open windows. Bright windows. Windows with sunlight pouring through them like escape routes. You can tell what children are missing by what they draw repeatedly, Annie said softly behind him. William looked back at her. And what are they missing here? Stability. She folded her arms loosely. Adults think children only need food and beds, but kids notice everything. They notice when bills aren't getting paid. They notice when staff members whisper in hallways. They notice when lights stay off because somebody's trying to save money. The room had gone strangely quiet again. One little girl near the shelf raised her hand carefully. Miss Annie? Yes, Rosie. Are we in trouble? Annie's face softened instantly. No, sweetheart. Then why's everybody talking like church people? Even Sister Grace laughed at that one. William crouched slightly to Rosie's height. Nobody's in trouble. Rosie narrowed her eyes suspiciously. That's usually what adults say right before trouble. Daniel coughed into his fist to hide a smile. William looked around the room again before finally asking the question that had clearly been sitting inside him since he walked through the front door. How close are you to shutting down? The silence afterward felt heavier than any answer. Sister Grace removed her glasses slowly. Closer than I let the children hear. Annie lowered her eyes. William nodded once, absorbing it quietly. How many children? 32 currently. And staff? 5, including me. Daniel muttered under his breath. That's impossible. Some days, Sister Grace replied calmly. It feels that way. A loud crash suddenly echoed from downstairs, followed by several children yelling. Lily sighed dramatically. That means Tommy tried carrying cereal again. She ran from the room before anyone could stop her. William watched her disappear down the hallway. She's 6? She's been here since 3, Annie said. No family? None that stayed. The words hit harder because Annie spoke them without bitterness. William moved toward the old supply shelf in the corner. He picked up a dried paint tray with only 2 usable colors left. How often do the children paint? When supplies exist, Annie answered. And when they don't? Annie shrugged slightly. Then they draw on cardboard boxes. Old receipts. Anything. Daniel stared openly now. You're telling me these kids made all this with almost nothing? That's usually how children survive, Sister Grace said quietly. They create worlds bigger than the ones they're trapped inside. William looked around the room one last time. The cracked ceiling, the worn tables, the drawings taped carefully to damaged walls because somebody wanted the children to feel their work mattered. Then his eyes settled on Annie again. You grew up in this room. Yes. And you still came back to help. Annie seemed confused by the question. Of course I came back. William stared at her for a moment before speaking softly. Most people spend their lives running from painful places. That only works if somebody else stays behind to fix them. No one answered immediately. Downstairs, children laughed loudly at whatever disaster Tommy had caused with the cereal. The sound floated upstairs through the old building like proof joy could survive almost anywhere. William slipped one hand into his coat pocket slowly. Daniel, he said without taking his eyes off the room. Yes, sir. Call my office. Daniel blinked once. Now? Now. Sister Grace looked at him carefully. Mr. Harrington, but William finally looked directly at her. No child should ever have to sleep under a leaking roof in this country, he said quietly. Not while people like me spend $30,000 renovating conference rooms. The room went still. Annie watched him closely, searching his face for performance, for pity, for temporary emotion dressed up as generosity. But what she saw instead unsettled her more. Guilt. Real guilt. Daniel already had his phone out. Who should I call? William kept looking at the ceiling stains above the children's artwork. Everyone, he said. Daniel stepped into the hallway with his phone already dialing while the children downstairs continued laughing over the cereal disaster. The normal sound of it made the conversation upstairs feel even heavier. Sister Grace folded her arms slowly. Mr. Harrington, I appreciate concern, but I've seen wealthy people walk through these halls before. William nodded once. I imagine you have. They cry, they promise things. Some donate enough to feel generous at dinner parties. Her eyes stayed steady on him. Then they disappear. Daniel paused near the doorway, pretending not to listen while someone answered on the other end of the line. William did not seem offended. You have every right to doubt me. I'm not doubting you, Sister Grace said calmly. I'm protecting them. The room went quiet. Annie leaned against the wall near the supply shelf, watching William carefully. Most powerful men pushed back when questioned. They mistook caution for disrespect. But William only glanced around the room again. You should protect them, he said. More adults should. Something in Sister Grace's expression softened, though only slightly. Daniel covered his phone. Sir, Rebecca from the foundation office is on the line. William held out his hand for the phone. Rebecca, I need a full emergency assessment team at Street Mary's Children Home. A pause crackled faintly through the speaker. No, not next week. Today. William looked up toward the stained ceiling again. Roof damage. Infrastructure. Supplies. Staffing. Everything. Another pause. Yes, I know my schedule. His voice stayed calm. Move the Savannah investors to Monday. Annie blinked. You're canceling meetings? William handed the phone back to Daniel. Children leaking through ceilings seem more urgent. Malcolm stared openly. Rich people can cancel meetings? Not usually, Daniel muttered. The little boy looked impressed by that. Sister Grace removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose slowly. Mr. Harrington, repairs alone won't solve the real problem. What's the real problem? Children keep arriving faster than help does. Nobody spoke after that. Downstairs, Lily's voice suddenly echoed upward. Tommy put cereal in the toaster again. William glanced toward the hallway. That sounds dangerous. It's Tuesday, Annie said dryly. Dangerous is part of the schedule here. For the first time since arriving, William laughed quietly. The sound surprised everyone, including himself. One of the younger girls peeked into the art room holding half a muffin. Are you really a billionaire? William crouched slightly. That's what the newspapers say. Do billionaires know movie stars? Sometimes, the girl thought carefully. Then can you tell Spider-Man we need blankets? Daniel turned away quickly to hide his expression. William answered without hesitation. I think Spider-Man would agree blankets are important. The little girl nodded, satisfied, and disappeared again. Annie watched William closely after that exchange. Most wealthy men spoke to children the way adults speak to pets. Patient, distracted, performative. William spoke to them like people. That mattered more than she expected. Sister Grace moved toward the hallway. I should stop Tommy from burning the building down. You want help? Annie asked. With Tommy? Only divine intervention helps Tommy. The older woman disappeared downstairs. William remained standing in the middle of the art room surrounded by children's drawings. Daniel lowered his voice carefully. Sir, are you certain about this? William looked at him. About repairing a children's home? You know that's not what I mean. Annie pretended not to hear. Daniel continued quietly. The board's already angry about the community housing project. If you suddenly redirect foundation money, William cut him off gently. Daniel, yes, sir? If the board can sleep peacefully while children use buckets to catch rainwater indoors, then perhaps the board needs to lose sleep. Daniel went silent. Annie stared at William for a moment before speaking carefully. You don't actually owe us anything. William turned toward her. I know. So why does this bother you so much? The question hung between them longer than Annie expected. Finally, William walked toward one of the walls covered in drawings. He stopped in front of a crayon picture showing a child sitting alone at a lunch table while other children laughed together nearby. My father grew up poor, he said quietly, very poor. He kept his eyes on the drawing. When I was a kid, he used to tell me the worst part wasn't hunger. What was it? Annie asked softly. William folded his hands behind his back. He said the worst part was realizing people could see you struggling and still decide you were invisible. The room fell silent again. He worked himself nearly to death, making sure I never felt that, William continued. And somewhere along the way. He paused. I built a life so busy I stopped seeing invisible people too. Annie lowered her eyes. Downstairs came another burst of laughter, followed by Mrs. Helen's voice drifting faintly through the building. Apparently she had arrived carrying more bakery boxes. Daniel glanced at his phone. Rebecca's team can be here within 2 hours. William nodded. Good. Annie frowned slightly. You move fast. When buildings collapse, speed matters. That's not what I meant. William understood immediately. You think this is guilt? Annie hesitated. Maybe. And if it is? She looked directly at him then. Guilt fades. Children still need breakfast after guilt fades. For a moment Daniel looked nervous. She had gone too far. But William only nodded slowly. Fair point. Annie crossed her arms loosely. I'm not trying to insult you. I know. A faint smile touched his face. You're trying to protect them too. That answer unsettled her more than anger would have. A loud pounding suddenly shook the front door downstairs. Then came Denise's voice. Annie, I know you're in there. Every child downstairs went quiet at once. Annie closed her eyes briefly. Daniel muttered under his breath. Here we go. Denise's voice rang through the building again. You cannot ignore me forever. Several of the younger children looked frightened immediately. William glanced toward the hallway. Does she often arrive like a hurricane? She usually waits until we're home first, Annie admitted. Sister Grace reappeared at the bottom of the stairs looking deeply tired already. Apparently the storm has found us. Denise pushed through the front entrance before anyone could stop her. Her heels clicked sharply across the old wooden floor as she looked around the crowded dining room with visible disgust. The moment she spotted William upstairs, her expression changed completely. "Mr. Harrington," she said breathlessly, "I had no idea you were still here." Annie almost laughed from disbelief. Denise climbed the stairs quickly, smoothing her coat as she moved. "I'm sorry if Annie caused trouble yesterday. She tends to become overly emotional about this place." William's face gave nothing away now. Below them, Lily whispered loudly to Malcolm, "Why does her smile look angry?" Malcolm whispered back, "Because rich adults fight with their teeth." Several children tried not to laugh. Denise ignored them and focused entirely on William. Annie has a good heart, but she gets attached to sad causes. The entire room changed temperature. Annie stiffened immediately. William spoke before she could. "Children without homes are not sad causes, Mrs. Carter." Denise's polished smile faltered slightly, and for the first time since arriving at Street Mary's, William Harrington sounded less like a businessman and more like a man who had finally grown tired of hearing compassion treated as weakness. Denise's polished smile faltered for only a second before she recovered it. "Of course," she said smoothly. "That isn't what I meant." But everyone in the room had heard exactly what she meant. Below the staircase, several children stood frozen with cereal bowls still in their hands. Annie hated that look on them, most of all the careful silence children learn when adults bring tension into places that are supposed to feel safe. Sister Grace stepped forward first. "Mrs. Carter, this isn't really a good time." Denise gave her a quick smile that carried no warmth. "I only came because Annie left home without handling her responsibilities." "I'm 18, Annie said quietly, "and still living under our roof." William glanced toward Annie but stayed silent. Denise noticed that immediately. "You see?" she continued lightly toward him. "She gets stubborn when she's emotional." Lily whispered to Malcolm downstairs. "Why do grown-ups always call girls emotional right before they ignore them?" Malcolm shrugged. "Probably because saying she's right hurts their feelings." Daniel looked down quickly to hide another laugh. Denise's eyes flicked toward the children with irritation before returning to William. "Mr. Harrington, I'm sure you understand how young people can become attached to unrealistic causes." William folded his hands loosely. "Feeding children is unrealistic? That's not what I said." "No," he replied calmly, "but it's what you implied." The air shifted again. Annie watched Denise carefully now. Her stepmother's anger always became more dangerous when she felt embarrassed. Denise sighed softly as though burdened by everyone else's misunderstanding. "Annie has always struggled to understand limits. My husband and I already support her. She acts as though we're monsters because we ask her to contribute at home." Annie opened her mouth, then stopped herself. William noticed. "What?" he asked gently. Annie hesitated. "Nothing." "No," Denise cut in quickly. "Go ahead. You clearly enjoy making me sound terrible." The children downstairs had gone completely quiet now. Annie hated that too. She looked toward Lily, gripping the railing beside Malcolm. Rosie hugging half a muffin against her sweater. Tommy staring upward with cereal still stuck to his sleeve. They were listening. Children always listened. Annie took a slow breath. "I don't think helping here should be treated like a childish distraction." Denise crossed her arms. "Because this place became your whole identity. This place kept me alive." The sentence landed hard enough that even Denise lost her answer for a moment. William's eyes shifted toward Annie slowly. Annie looked down immediately after saying it, like she regretted letting something so honest escape in front of everyone. Sister Grace spoke quietly into the silence. "Children remember who fed them when they were scared." Denise laughed once under her breath. "And now she's trying to save the world with sidewalk paintings." William turned fully toward Annie then. "How much did you raise yesterday?" Annie blinked, caught off guard. $100. Denise scoffed softly. But William nodded like the number mattered. "Do you know how many people with wealth never bother giving away even 10? That shut the room still again. Daniel leaned against the wall, quietly watching his employer with an expression halfway between admiration and confusion. William Harrington negotiated billion-dollar developments without blinking. Yet somehow this old building full of leaking ceilings had reached him faster than boardrooms ever did. One of the younger boys downstairs finally raised his hand carefully. Denise frowned. "What now?" The boy looked at William instead. "Mister, are rich people allowed to be nice?" Several children giggled nervously. William answered seriously. They're supposed to be. That's not what TV says, Tommy muttered. Even Sister Grace smiled at that. Denise clearly realized the room was slipping away from her. She straightened her coat sharply. Annie, we're leaving. No, Annie said. This time the word came easier. Denise stared at her. Excuse me? I said no. You don't get to speak to me like that. Annie's voice stayed calm now, which somehow made it stronger. I spent years being quiet because I thought gratitude meant obedience. She glanced briefly toward the children before continuing. But children hear everything adults say about them. They hear when they're called burdens, problems, expensive. Her eyes returned to Denise. I won't let these kids hear me act ashamed of caring about them. No one moved. William looked at Annie differently after that. Not like a talented girl anymore. Like someone far older than 18. Denise laughed sharply, but there was panic underneath it now. You're being dramatic in front of strangers. Annie shook her head once. No, I'm just finally saying things out loud. Downstairs, Lily whispered very loudly. That was awesome. Sister Grace pinched the bridge of her nose. Lily. What? It was. Denise turned toward William again, searching desperately for control. Mr. Harrington, surely you can see this is emotional manipulation. William looked around the room slowly before answering. What I see, he said quietly, is a young woman defending children while the adults around her keep treating compassion like weakness. Denise's face hardened completely then. The polished mask finally cracked. You've known her for one day, she snapped. You have no idea how exhausting she is. Annie flinched slightly before she could stop herself. William noticed, and something in him changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough that Daniel straightened a little against the wall because he recognized the look immediately. It was the expression William Harrington wore before dismantling someone in a boardroom. William stepped closer, his voice still calm. Mrs. Carter, I've spent most of my life around people who confuse control with responsibility. He glanced briefly toward the children downstairs. Children are not exhausting because they care too much. Denise opened her mouth. They become exhausted. William continued. When adults keep teaching them, their kindness is inconvenient. Silence. Real silence this time. Even the children stopped whispering. Annie stared at him as though she had never heard someone defend her without asking for anything in return. Denise's cheeks flushed with anger. You're turning her against her family. No, Annie said softly before William could answer. Truth did that. The sentence hit harder than shouting ever could. For several long seconds, Denise simply stood there, breathing tightly through her nose while the old building creaked quietly around them. Then Lily spoke again from downstairs. Miss Annie? Annie looked over the railing. Yeah? Sweetheart? Lily held up her muffin carefully. If rich people help fix the roof, does that mean we can stop putting buckets in the hallway? The room seemed to stop breathing. William looked at the child, then at the ceiling stains above her, then back at Annie, and for the first time since entering St. Mary's, he understood something painful all at once. These children had learned not to ask for too much because disappointment had trained them early. William loosened his tie slowly like the room had suddenly become harder to breathe in. No, he said quietly to Lily. You won't need the buckets anymore. Annie turned toward him immediately, not because she doubted him, because she knew promises become dangerous the moment children believe them. Annie turned toward William immediately, not because she doubted him, because she knew promises become dangerous the moment children believe them. Lily's eyes widened hopefully. Really? William looked at the little girl carefully before answering again, slower this time. Really? The building had gone so quiet that even the old radiator clicking near the hallway sounded loud. Sister Grace studied William's face for a long moment. People often promised help while avoiding eye contact. William did neither. Denise broke the silence first with a sharp laugh. Well, that's generous. Her voice carried that familiar edge people used when kindness from others made them uncomfortable. Though repairing a roof is hardly the same thing as saving this place. William turned toward her calmly. Good thing I never said I planned to stop at the roof. Daniel looked up immediately. Annie blinked. Mr. Harrington, but William was already walking slowly toward the hallway ceiling stain near the staircase. Rainwater had warped the plaster there into a dark, uneven circle. A bucket sat underneath it with cloudy water collected at the bottom. He crouched beside it silently, then he looked up at the children surrounding the staircase. "How long has this been here?" Tommy answered first. "The big leak?" "Since summer." Rosie corrected him. "No, before summer." "Long enough," Sister Grace said quietly. William touched the side of the bucket lightly. "And nobody fixed it?" "We patched it twice," Sister Grace replied. "But temporary repairs cost less than real ones." Annie watched him carefully. She could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Not business calculations, human ones. How long had children been stepping around this bucket at night? How many storms had they listened to while pretending not to be scared? Daniel's phone buzzed suddenly. He checked the screen. Rebecca's team just arrived outside. Several children rushed toward the windows immediately. 3 white trucks had pulled up beside the building. Men and women carrying clipboards, tool belts, and cameras stepped onto the sidewalk. Lily gasped. "That's more workers than we've had since the raccoon incident." William looked concerned. "Raccoon incident?" "We don't talk about the raccoon incident," Sister Grace said firmly. Tommy raised his hand proudly. "I named him Gregory." Sister Grace closed her eyes briefly. The front door opened downstairs and Rebecca Collins entered briskly wearing a navy coat and carrying a tablet under one arm. Mid-40s, sharp posture, efficient eyes. The kind of woman who could probably organize a hurricane into alphabetical order. She stopped halfway into the building. "Good Lord." Her voice was quiet enough that she probably did not mean for anyone to hear it. William walked downstairs toward her. "Rebecca, you weren't exaggerating." "No." Rebecca slowly turned in place, taking in the worn floors, patched walls, crowded coat hooks, and children watching nervously from every direction. Then she noticed the bucket beneath the leak. Her jaw tightened. "How many children?" she asked immediately. 32, Sister Grace answered while descending the stairs beside Annie. Rebecca nodded once and began typing quickly into the tablet. "We'll need structural inspection, roofing, plumbing evaluation, electrical safety review." One little boy whispered to Malcolm. "She talks like a robot principal." Rebecca looked up without missing a beat. "I heard that." The boy nearly jumped out of his shoes. William almost smiled. Annie noticed something strange then. The children were staying close to her now. Not hiding exactly. Anchoring themselves. Because Hope had entered the building, and children never trusted Hope right away. Rebecca approached Annie directly. "You're the artist?" Annie looked confused. "I guess. She means the reason Mr. Harrington canceled 2 investor meetings and dragged half the foundation staff across Charleston in 4 hours, Daniel clarified. Rebecca gave William a long look. "He hasn't done that for a hospital." William ignored him. "Annie grew up here." Rebecca's expression softened slightly after that. "You painted those canvases downtown?" "Yes, ma'am." "The room with the moonlight?" Annie nodded slowly. Rebecca studied her for another second before quietly saying, "That painting made a 50-year-old billionaire skip lunch and start swearing at roofing contractors." "I thought you should know that." Daniel coughed to hide a laugh. William sighed. "Rebecca." "What?" "It's true." For the first time all morning, Annie smiled without forcing it. Denise stood near the staircase looking increasingly invisible and increasingly angry about it. She crossed her arms sharply. "This all seems very dramatic for one old building." Every adult in the room went still. Sister Grace spoke before anyone else could. "Mrs. Carter." "Children sleep here," Denise shrugged lightly. "And now apparently billionaires are rushing in to save the day because Annie painted a few sad pictures." Annie stiffened immediately, but William turned toward Denise with a calmness that felt more dangerous than anger. "Do you know why her paintings matter?" he asked. Denise rolled her eyes faintly. "Because they manipulate emotions?" "No." William's voice stayed steady. "Because they force people to look at suffering they've trained themselves not to see." The room fell silent again. William glanced toward the children nearby. Most people walk past places like this and feel relieved that Annie painted these children in a way that made ignoring them impossible. Denise laughed softly. "You're talking about paintings like they're changing the world." William looked at the room that stayed awake, still leaning carefully against the dining room wall. "Sometimes they do." Annie lowered her eyes quickly before anyone noticed the emotion crossing her face. Outside, workers had already started examining the roof while ladders came off the trucks. The children crowded the windows watching like Christmas had arrived, carrying toolboxes. Lily tugged William's coat sleeve gently. Mister? Yes? If they fix the roof, she hesitated. Will the rain sound different? William looked down at her carefully, then toward the stained ceiling above. Yes, he said softly. I think it will. Lily smiled at that like it was the greatest promise she had ever heard. And standing there in the middle of street, Mary's children's home surrounded by leaking ceilings, frightened hope, and children who had learned not to expect too much, William Harrington finally understood something his wealth had hidden from him for years. People do not break all at once. Sometimes they break one disappointment at a time until even dry ceilings start feeling miraculous. By noon, Street Mary's no longer sounded like an orphanage trying to survive quietly. It sounded like construction. Boots crossed the hallways, ladders scraped against walls. Voices echoed from the roof while workers measured leaks and examined cracked beams. Children followed the repair crews everywhere until Sister Grace finally ordered them to stop, adopting contractors like stray cats. Tommy ignored her immediately. A roofer named Mike ended up explaining shingles to 6 children while balancing on a ladder near the upstairs hallway. No, buddy, Mike laughed as Tommy handed him a plastic spoon. I cannot fix a roof with yogurt. You don't know until you try, Tommy answered seriously. Downstairs, Rebecca sat at the dining table surrounded by paperwork, while Daniel typed numbers into his laptop beside her. Annie carried fresh coffee from the kitchen and placed a mug near Rebecca's elbow. Thank you, Rebecca said without looking up. Annie glanced at the papers. That bad? Rebecca finally exhaled and leaned back. Honestly? She tapped the folder. Worse. Annie sat slowly across from her. The electrical wiring upstairs is almost 20 years out of code, Rebecca continued. Half the roof insulation is rotting. The west bathroom pipes are leaking inside the walls. She looked toward the ceiling. And if another major storm hits before repairs... She stopped herself. The roof could collapse, Annie finished quietly. Rebecca held her gaze for a second. Yes, the words settled heavily between them. Across the room, William stood near the window speaking into his phone with one of the contractors. Calm, direct, focused. Annie noticed he had not checked his watch once since arriving. That mattered more than she wanted it to. Lily climbed into the chair beside Annie holding a crayon drawing. Miss Rebecca? Yes? If rich people fix our building, does that mean we become rich too? Rebecca smiled tiredly. No, sweetheart. Lily frowned. Then rich sounds overrated. Daniel nearly spit out his coffee laughing. William walked back toward the table just in time to hear the last part. I'm starting to agree with her. Rebecca handed him another folder. The estimated repair costs. William opened it. Daniel leaned slightly toward Annie. This is usually the part where investors panic. William scanned the numbers silently. Annie watched his face carefully. No reaction. No hesitation. Just concentration. Finally, he closed the folder. Approve it, he said. Rebecca blinked once. All of it? All of it. Nanny stared at him. That's a lot of money. William looked around the room. So is neglect. People just prefer pretending they don't pay for that too. The dining hall went quiet again. Near the kitchen doorway, Sister Grace paused while drying dishes with a towel. She had spent decades learning not to trust rescue too quickly. But even she looked shaken now. Mr. Harrington, she said carefully, do you understand what you're committing to? Yes. This building doesn't only need repairs. I know. We need counselors, tutors, beds, transportation, winter supplies. Her voice softened. Some of these children arrive carrying more trauma than luggage. William nodded once. Then we handle that too. Rebecca looked up sharply. William, no child should feel temporary inside their own childhood, he said quietly. Nobody answered after that. Annie lowered her eyes because something inside her chest had suddenly become difficult to hold steady. At the far end of the room, Denise stood near the entrance looking increasingly uncomfortable. No one had paid attention to her in nearly 20 minutes. That seemed to bother her more than the repairs themselves. She finally stepped forward. This is becoming excessive. William looked at her calmly. Repairing unsafe living conditions is excessive? You're throwing money at emotions. No, he replied evenly. I'm throwing money at a leaking roof. Daniel coughed into his hand again. Denise folded her arms tightly. And what happens after the headlines disappear? There are no headlines, William answered. I never called reporters. That stopped her. Annie noticed it too. Most wealthy people wanted witnesses when they donated. Public kindness often came with photographers attached. But there were no cameras here. No press releases. No speeches. Just workers carrying lumber through old hallways while children followed them asking questions every 30 seconds. Tommy ran past, suddenly holding a measuring tape like a championship trophy. "Miss Annie. The roof guy says our ceiling was one storm away from becoming a swimming pool." Inside voices, Sister Grace called automatically. "We almost drowned politely," Tommy shouted back. Even Rebecca laughed at that. William looked toward Annie quietly. "How long have you been trying to help this place alone?" "I wasn't alone." Annie glanced toward Sister Grace. "And the staff. You know what I mean." She hesitated. "Since I moved back nearby after high school. You could have left Charleston. I tried once." William waited. Annie looked down at her hands. "I got accepted into an art program in Atlanta." A faint smile touched her face briefly. Elaine framed the acceptance letter. "What happened?" "Tuition happened." Annie shrugged lightly. "Then Elaine got sick." She paused. "After she passed, Street Marys started struggling more. So," she gestured around the building, "so you stayed. It didn't feel right leaving." William studied her quietly. "You gave up your future for this place." "No." Annie shook her head immediately. "I just postponed one version of it." The answer stayed with him. Near the staircase, Lily tugged on Daniel's sleeve. "Do assistants get rich too?" Daniel looked horrified. "Not assistant rich, no. That seems unfair." "It absolutely is." William rubbed a hand briefly across his mouth, hiding another smile. Then Rebecca's phone rang. She checked the screen and frowned. "William." "What?" "The board somehow heard about this already." Daniel muttered under his breath. "Of course they did." Rebecca stood and walked a few feet away before answering. Her voice stayed low, but tension sharpened every word. "Yes, no, he's here now. Because children are living under structural damage, Richard." The room slowly quieted around her. William's face changed slightly. Not angry, just tired. Annie noticed immediately. "Trouble?" "The foundation board dislikes surprises." "You mean they dislike compassion that costs money?" William looked at her. "That sounded less harsh in my head," Annie admitted. "No," he said softly. "It sounded accurate." Rebecca returned a minute later looking irritated. "They want an emergency meeting tonight." William sighed quietly. "They think you're overcommitting emotionally." Lily whispered loudly to Tommy. "Adults say emotional when they mean expensive." Tommy nodded wisely. "That's because bills scare them." William closed the repair folder slowly. Then he looked around Street Marys one more time. At the workers repairing ceilings, at children carrying crayons like treasure, at Annie standing near the dining table with charcoal still faintly staining her fingertips. And suddenly, the board meeting waiting downtown felt very far away from what actually mattered. "They can wait," he said. Rebecca blinked. "William, no." His voice stayed calm. "Children waited first." "They can wait," he said. Rebecca blinked. "William, no." His voice stayed calm. "Children waited first." The dining room fell silent again. Rebecca stared at him for a long second before slowly closing the folder in her hands. "You know they're going to fight you on this." William glanced toward the workers carrying supplies upstairs. "Then they can fight me after the roof stops leaking." Daniel leaned back in his chair quietly smiling into his coffee like a man watching history rearrange itself in real time. Near the hallway entrance, Denise looked completely out of place now. The room had moved on without her. Contractors spoke with Sister Grace. Children followed workers carrying ladders. Rebecca reorganized budgets with machine-like efficiency. No one cared about appearances anymore. That seemed to bother Denise most of all. She finally looked toward Annie sharply. "Your father has been calling." Annie's shoulders tightened immediately. "Is he all right?" "He's worried sick because you disappeared into this circus." William's eyes shifted briefly toward Annie. "I didn't disappear," Annie said quietly. "I told him where I was. You embarrassed this family downtown yesterday." The old shame flickered across Annie's face before she could hide it. William noticed. Sister Grace noticed too. The older woman dried her hands slowly with a kitchen towel before speaking. "Mrs. Carter, I've known Annie since she was 6 years old." Her voice remained calm but firm. "The child has spent most of her life apologizing for taking up space. I don't think she needs more practice." Denise opened her mouth, then closed it again. Across the room, Tommy whispered loudly to Malcolm, "Sister Grace is using her church voice." "That's the dangerous one," Malcolm whispered back. Even Rebecca smiled briefly at that. Annie lowered her eyes, fighting emotion again. William had defended her. Sister Grace had defended her. It should not have felt unusual at 18 years old. But somehow it still did. The front door opened suddenly before anyone could speak again. Robert Carter stepped inside. Oil stains darkened the sleeves of his work jacket from the garage. His gray hair looked windblown, his expression exhausted. The moment he saw Annie standing near the dining table, relief crossed his face so openly it hurt to look at. "There you are." Annie moved toward him immediately. "Dad." Robert hugged her before she finished speaking. Not dramatically, just tightly enough that Annie stopped carrying tension in her shoulders for the first time all day. "You scared me," he muttered quietly. "I'm sorry." He pulled back slightly, looking at her face carefully the way parents do when they are checking for damage no one else notices. Then he finally became aware of the room around him. The workers, the ladders, William Harrington standing beside Rebecca Collins. Robert blinked once. What exactly happened here? Tommy answered proudly before anyone else could. "The billionaire adopted our roof." Sister Grace pressed her lips together, trying not to laugh. Robert looked completely lost. "I'm sorry?" Annie wiped quickly beneath one eye before the tears could fully appear. "It's a long story." Denise crossed her arms sharply. "A ridiculous story." Robert looked toward her tiredly. "Denise." "No, Robert. She skipped responsibilities at home, caused a public scene, and now somehow she has construction crews rebuilding an orphanage." Robert glanced around Street Mary's slowly. At the water stains, at the buckets, at the children watching nervously from the staircase. Then he looked back at Denise. "Sounds like the orphanage needed rebuilding." The room went still again. Denise stared at him. "You're taking her side?" "I'm taking the side of common sense." Annie looked at her father in surprise. Robert sighed heavily and rubbed a grease-stained hand across his forehead. Elaine used to bring Annie here every Sunday after the adoption. His eyes moved around the room softly. "She always said this place saved Annie before we ever could." Sister Grace lowered her gaze quietly. Robert looked toward William. "Mr. Harrington, I assume." William stepped forward and extended his hand. "William's fine." Robert shook it firmly. "I own Carter Auto Repair down on Mason Street. Not exactly your tax bracket." William's expression stayed even. "Good people rarely are." Daniel looked down immediately to hide a smile. Robert glanced toward the workers upstairs. "You're really helping this place?" "Yes." "Why?" William looked toward Annie standing beside her father. "Because your daughter forced an entire street to stop pretending suffering was somebody else's problem." Annie looked embarrassed instantly. "Please don't say things like that in front of me." Robert laughed quietly under his breath. "Yeah, that sounds like Annie." Denise looked furious now, though she tried to hide it. "Everyone's acting like she cured cancer because she painted a few pictures." "No," Robert answered before anyone else could. "They're acting like kindness matters because it does." That shut her up completely. For a while, the room settled into movement again. Workers continued measuring upstairs. Rebecca coordinated supply deliveries over the phone. Mrs. Helen arrived carrying 2 giant pots of chili and immediately started ordering contractors to eat before they fell off ladders from low blood sugar. Then Lily appeared beside William carrying a folded piece of paper. "I made you something." William crouched slightly. "You didn't have to do that." "I know. That's why it's a gift." Daniel whispered under his breath. "I think she just out-negotiated you, sir." William unfolded the paper carefully. It was a drawing. Street Mary's under bright yellow sunlight. No buckets, no cracks, flowers in front of the building, children waving from every window. And beside the front steps stood a tall man in a gray coat holding a hammer much larger than his head. William stared at it quietly. "You made me bald," he said after a moment. Lily gasped. "That's your hair." The room burst into laughter. Even William laughed then, full and genuine this time. Annie watched him carefully from across the dining room. Something had changed since yesterday on King Street. Not only in Street Mary's. In him, powerful men usually entered places expecting to be admired. William Harrington had entered this building and somehow become willing to be changed instead. That was rarer than money. Outside the front windows, rain clouds gathered again over Charleston, but for the first time in years, nobody at Street Mary's looked nervous when the sky darkened. 3 weeks later, the sound of rain hitting Street Marys no longer woke children in fear. It woke them in peace. Water rolled across a brand new roof instead of dripping through cracked ceilings into plastic buckets. Fresh paint covered the upstairs hallways. The old warped windows had been replaced. Beds no longer leaned unevenly against damaged floors. Even the dining room lights looked warmer now that they stopped flickering every few minutes. And for the first time in years, the building smelled less like mildew and more like dinner. Mrs. Helen stood in the kitchen stirring a giant pot of chicken stew while pretending not to cry every time she looked around. "I hate emotional renovations," she muttered. "You've cried 6 times today," Rebecca answered from the table nearby. 7, Tommy corrected proudly. "I counted." Mrs. Helen pointed her spoon at him. "You count one more thing in this kitchen, and you're peeling potatoes." Tommy sat down immediately. Outside, cars lined the street in front of Street Marys. Not reporters, not photographers. Neighbors. People arrived carrying boxes of books, winter coats, canned food, blankets, toys, school supplies. Quiet generosity spread through Charleston faster than anyone expected after word leaked about the repairs. Mr. Benson from the leather shop delivered brand new boots for every child before awkwardly insisting he just had extra inventory. Nobody believed him, but Sister Grace thanked him anyway. The teenage girl from King Street returned with her mother carrying art supplies and 3 purchased paintings tucked under her arm. Even the man in sunglasses showed up one afternoon with boxes of cereal and refused to explain himself. Charleston had not become perfect, but shame had finally started moving people. Annie stood near the front entrance hanging paper snowflakes beside Lily, while workers finished installing the new hallway lights. "You missed a spot," Lily announced. "It's snowflakes, not surgery. Pretty sure snowflakes matter more." Annie laughed softly and adjusted the tape. The front doors opened then, letting in a gust of cold December air. William stepped inside carrying 2 framed canvases under one arm, while Daniel followed behind him balancing coffee trays. The children rushed toward them instantly now without hesitation. Not because William was rich, because he had kept showing up. "Mr. Harrington," Rosie shouted. Tommy glued his fingers together again. William handed Daniel the frames immediately. "Is this becoming a hobby?" "It was science," Tommy defended. "Science usually involves less screaming," Daniel muttered. Annie walked toward William, smiling before she remembered herself and tried to hide it. "You're late." William looked offended. "I brought coffee." "That's not a defense." "It absolutely is." Lily pointed suspiciously toward the framed canvases. "What's that?" William glanced at Daniel. "You want to tell them or should I?" Daniel sighed dramatically. Mr. Harrington made a decision without warning the rest of us again. Rebecca looked up from the dining room table immediately. "That sentence never ends well." William ignored her and turned toward Annie. "Come outside for a minute." Annie frowned slightly. "Why?" "You'll see." The children immediately tried following until Sister Grace clapped once sharply. "Nobody stampedes the billionaire." "But what if he needs emotional support?" Tommy argued. "He has Daniel for that." Daniel looked deeply insulted. Outside, the cold Charleston wind swept through the front steps, while evening lights flickered on across the street. A small crowd had gathered near the sidewalk. Neighbors, workers, people from nearby shops, and standing near the curb beneath a cloth covering nearly 6 feet tall sat something Annie clearly had not expected. She stopped walking. "William." He looked strangely nervous now, which Annie realized might have been the first time she had seen it. "A few people wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Nobody answered immediately. Then Mr. Benson stepped forward awkwardly. "Kid, this whole street spent years walking past problems because they weren't convenient." He cleared his throat roughly. "You made people stop." The teenage girl from King Street smiled. "My mom cried over your paintings for 2 days." "I did not," her mother argued weakly. "You absolutely did." Mrs. Helen appeared beside Annie carrying her coat tighter against the wind. "That little sidewalk display of yours embarrassed half this city into remembering children exist." Annie looked overwhelmed already. "I didn't do any of this alone." "No," William said softly, "but you started it." Before Annie could answer, Lily grabbed the edge of the large cloth covering near the sidewalk. "Can I pull it?" William looked at Annie first. She stared at the covered object nervously. "What is it?" "A reminder," William answered. Lily yanked the cloth down before anyone could become more emotional than necessary. The crowd went quiet. It was a bronze sculpture, Annie froze completely. The statue showed a young woman sitting cross-legged on a city sidewalk holding a paintbrush in one hand and a small canvas in the other. Beside her rested a tin donation box and a cardboard sign. Paintings for Street Mary's Children's Home, $10 each. But it was the expression on the sculpture's face that stole the air from Annie's lungs. Not sadness, determination. The kind, quiet people carry after surviving things nobody applauds them for. At the base of the statue, a bronze plaque reflected the streetlights. One person stopped, then a city did. For several seconds, Annie could not speak. "William." Her voice broke slightly. "You shouldn't have done this." "Yes," he said calmly. "I should have." She looked around at the gathered crowd. Workers, children, neighbors, people who once walked past her paintings without stopping. Now they stood there in silence beneath the Charleston lights, looking at a girl who once believed she had to make herself small to deserve space in the world. Robert stepped beside his daughter quietly. "Your mother would have lost her mind seeing this." Annie laughed through tears, suddenly escaping despite her efforts. "Elaine would have complained the statue made my hair look too neat." That too. Nearby, Denise stood apart from the crowd near the edge of the sidewalk. Silent. Uncomfortable. Watching a city honor the same compassion she had spent years dismissing as weakness. But nobody looked toward Denise anymore. The story had moved beyond her. Lily tugged Annie's sleeve gently. "Miss Annie?" Annie wiped quickly beneath her eyes. "Yeah, sweetheart." The little girl pointed toward the statue. "You look brave." Annie stared at the bronze version of herself for a long moment before answering softly. "No, honey." She looked down at Lily. Brave was every child in that building who kept hoping adults would finally care. William watched her then with the same expression he had worn the first day on King Street while holding the room that stayed awake. Recognition, because Annie still did not understand the full truth. The city had not changed because of money. It changed because an 18-year-old girl sat on a cold sidewalk selling $10 paintings and refused to let invisible children stay invisible anymore. Above them, Christmas lights flickered softly across Charleston, while laughter drifted from inside Street Mary's through windows that no longer leaked when it rained. And for the first time in a very long time, the children inside that building no longer sounded temporary. Sometimes the world does not change because of powerful people. It changes because one ordinary person refuses to walk past suffering in silence. Annie's story reminds us that kindness is not weakness, and compassion is not something to be ashamed of. Children do not need perfect heroes, they need adults who choose to see them, protect them, and care before it is too late. One small act of courage, even something as simple as a $10 painting, can awaken the conscience of an entire community. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.